Stay exactly where you are, and for a moment, let the modern world with its double-glazed windows and climate-controlled comfort fade into a distant digital hum. Sit a little closer to the hearth, for the story I have for you tonight is one that breathes within the very rafters of the grand mansions you admire from afar. Outside, the London fog is a heavy gray shroud clinging to the iron railings and gas lamps, but inside this sanctuary, we are warm. Or so we think. We often look at the Victorian era as a pinnacle of architectural grace, a time of soaring ceilings and mahogany grandeur. But the Victorian mansion was not a home. It was a complex, multi-layered machine designed for total social deception. It was a stage where the actors lived in the light of the parlor, while an entire army of invisible souls was tucked away in the scalp of the house. Tonight, we are going to climb the stairs that guests were never meant to see. We are going to explore the attic prison, the psychological cells where the spirit of the Victorian servant was broken, one vertical foot at a time. Before we begin our ascent into the lightless rafters, I invite you to join our circle. If you find a strange sort of peace in uncovering the dark, tactile mysteries of the past, please consider leaving a mark of your presence. A like, a thoughtful comment, or sharing this chronicle with a fellow seeker of shadows helps keep our lanterns burning through the long night. Your company is the very heartbeat of these stories, and your engagement is the coal that keeps this fire roaring against the encroaching dark. Imagine you are a guest at a high society dinner in 1875. You admire the verticality of the house, the way it reaches toward the heavens. But for the young girl who carried your tray, that verticality was a curse. To reach her refuge at the end of a 19-hour shift, she had to climb past the grand bedrooms, past the nurseries, and up a hidden, stone spiral that led to the attic. In your modern life, an attic is a cozy loft or a place for storage. In 1875, it was a biological experiment in endurance. There was no insulation here. Under the slate roof, the rooms were suffocating ovens in the summer and frozen iron boxes in the winter. It was the final destination of the invisible army, a place where the deception was so complete that human beings were quite literally tucked into the rafters like unwanted insulation. But let us talk about the most basic necessity of survival, the food that kept these ghosts moving. You might complain today if your delivery is 10 minutes late or if your avocado isn't perfectly ripe. But for the inhabitant of the attic, sustenance was a game of medieval WebMD, where every symptom led to a slow death. While the family below feasted on roasted pheasant and French wines, the attic dwellers lived on the scraps of the scraps. The Victorian diet for the servant class was a masterpiece of nutritional sabotage. Bread was the foundation of their lives, but it was rarely just flour and water. To maximize profit, bakers laced the loaves with alum, a chemical used in tanning leather, to make gray, low-quality flour look as snowy white as the bread served to the masters. It was a beautiful lie that destroyed the digestive system from the inside out. Imagine sitting on a straw pallet in the dark, chewing on a piece of bread that felt like chalk in your mouth. The milk you were given was often blue milk, watered down until it was translucent, then thickened with pulverized sheep's brains or chalk to regain its creamy appearance. This was the career counselor of the Victorian age. It told you that your place was at the bottom of the food chain. Literally, every calorie was a gamble. They were pioneers of a chemical frontier they didn't understand, eating a landscape of adulterated sugar and copper-boiled vegetables. We think of our ancestors as sturdier than us, but they were being chemically altered by their own rations. This was the sustento e sopravvivenza of the attic prison. You worked until your muscles screamed, and then you fueled that scream with bread that contained tanning chemicals and milk that contained brains. It was a physical and psychological erosion. The masters wanted the fruit of labor without ever witnessing the sweat, and they wanted the servants to exist on a diet that mirrored their social invisibility, cheap, white, and devoid of substance. You sit in your quiet room now, perhaps with a glass of filtered water, or a snack that has been vetted by 1,000 safety regulations. Feel the weight of that privilege. The girl in the attic had no such safety. She was a biological extension of the house's plumbing, fueled by the cheapest fuel available, living in a space that the world forgot to heat or cool. But the food was merely the first layer of the deception. It was the hardware of the house that kept them moving, but it was the horror of the body that truly broke them. For if the food was a gamble with a tombstone, the hygiene of the attic was a visceral nightmare that no amount of lace could hide. As the fire in our hearth flickers, we must prepare to move from the stomach to the skin, for the reality of Victorian cleanliness was a shock that would make your modern soul recoil. The bread was poison, but the water was a tragedy. The chill in the air deepens as the fire settles into a steady, rhythmic pulse. To understand the attic prison, we must look past the heavy mahogany doors of the master's suite and stare directly into the visceral shock of the servant's reality. In your modern life, hygiene is a private, effortless ritual. You step into a shower of steaming, purified water. You use soaps designed to nourish your skin. You look into a clear mirror in a room that is as warm as the rest of your home. You value the transparency of your own body. But for the inhabitant of the attic, hygiene was not a comfort. It was a war against the physical self, fought in a sunless box where the very air was a thief. Imagine finishing a day of hauling coal and scrubbing grates, your lungs gray with soot and your skin slick with the grease of a dozen mutton roasts. You climb those final, punishing steps to your cell under the roof. There is no running water here. There's only a single, cracked ceramic basin and a pitcher of water that was carried up 3 flights of stairs by you hours ago. In the dead of winter, you must first break the thick crust of ice that has formed on the surface of the water just to wash your face. This was the shocking contrast of Victorian cleanliness. The lady downstairs bathed in a copper tub filled with rose-scented warmth, while the girl who served her was forced to strip in a room where her own breath hung in the air like a ghost. But it wasn't just the cold, it was the horror of the hidden. Because a full bath was an impossible luxury that could take an entire day to prepare, the Victorian servant lived in a state of perpetual, suppressed filth. They used dry washes of ammonia or even diluted acid to strip the oils from their skin, chemically burning away the sweat they weren't allowed to wash away with water. Their hair, which could not be dried in the freezing attic without risking pneumonia, went unwashed for months. They used heavy, rancid pomades made of animal fats to slick it back, creating a breeding ground for lice and fleas that lived in the dark spaces between the rafters and their scalps. You might worry about a bad hair day, but they lived with a scalp that was a literal ecosystem of parasites, masked only by the sharp, stinging scent of lavender oil or vinegar. Here's a terrifying fact. The very water they used was often a delivery system for death. In a grand mansion, the lead pipes that carried water to the lower floors often bypassed the attics entirely. The servants often relied on cistern water, stagnant pools kept in lead-lined tanks in the roof. This water was a soup of drowned vermin, bird droppings, and slowly dissolving lead. While the family drank from filtered carafes, the invisible army was washing their sores and drinking from a supply that was neurotoxic. They were literally scrubbing the painted death into their pores every night. It was a world of ides falsas para beber agua, where even the most basic element of life was a fraudulent, poisoned version of what was served below. This was the choque eschatologico of the attic prison. The masters demanded absolute physical purity from their staff, yet they provided them with the hygiene of a medieval dungeon. A maid was expected to smell like nothing at all, to be a sensory vacuum, yet she was denied the tools to even be clean. If she smelled of the sweat of her labor, she was vulgar. If she used too much perfume to hide it, she was vain. It was a psychological trap designed to make her feel perpetually ashamed of her own biological existence. The attic was the place where this shame was most concentrated, a place where the scent of unwashed wool, damp stone, and rotting lead created a bouquet of misery that even the highest rafters could not ventilate. As you sit in your honest, modern room, listening to the soft hum of your plumbing, feel the weight of that biological imprisonment. Imagine the exhaustion of a body that is never truly clean, sleeping on a straw mattress that rustles with the movement of bedbugs, in a room that smells of stagnant water and old grease. The Victorian mansion was a masterpiece of sensory suppression, but for those in the rafters, the senses were a constant source of pain. Stay with me, for the fire is shifting, and we are about to leave the basin and the bed behind to face the crushing weight of the invisible routine. The hygiene was a nightmare, but the work was an industrial slaughter of the soul. I urge you to stay until the final ember dies, for the true secret of the attic is not how they lived, but how they were forced to disappear. The fire crackles with a sudden, sharp intensity, as if protesting the weight of the stories we are uncovering. As we leave the freezing basin of the attic behind, we must confront the crushing gears of the brutal routine. In your modern life, you likely speak of work-life balance, ergonomic chairs, and shift limits. You have a clear boundary between where you labor and where you rest. But for the inhabitant of the attic prison, there was no such thing as off the clock. The house was a vertical factory that never stopped humming, and the body of the servant was the fuel it consumed with a voracious, mechanical hunger. Imagine the sound of the 4 a.m. bell. It doesn't ring in the soft, melodic way of a church tower. It is a sharp, metallic scream that pierces the thin walls of your attic cell. You wake up in total darkness, your muscles still screaming from the 19 hours of labor you performed yesterday. This is the deconstruction of expectations regarding the Victorian life. We imagine it as a slow, dignified era of tea and poetry, but for the invisible army, it was a high-speed industrial grind. Your first task of the day is not to make coffee or check your messages. It is to descend 4 flights of stairs to the freezing basement, haul 40 pounds of coal back up those same stairs, and light the fires before the masters even stir in their silk-lined cocoons. This was the vertical slaughter. A housemaid in a grand London mansion would climb the equivalent of Mount Everest every week, carrying heavy copper cans of boiling water, scuttling trays of coal, and massive piles of laundry. In our world, we pay for gym memberships to simulate this kind of movement. In their world, this was a career counselor that aged a 20-year-old girl into a bent, broken woman by 30. Their knees would swell with housemaid's knee, a painful inflammation from hours of scrubbing stone floors on their joints, and their spines would curve under the weight of a house that was built to be a monument to someone else's status. But the physical toll was only half of the brutal routine. The true weight was the social erasure. Within these walls, you were not a person, you were a function. If you were a housemaid, you were Jane or Mary, regardless of the name your mother gave you, simply because it was easier for the mistress to remember a generic label. You were a hardware of the house, expected to operate with the silence of a clock and the invisibility of a ghost. If a member of the family were to walk down the hallway while you were scrubbing the floor, you were expected to turn your face to the wall or disappear into a doorway. To be seen was to fail. To be heard was a sin. It was a psychological prison where your very presence was considered a blemish on the deception of the house. Contrast this with your modern workspace. Even in the most demanding jobs, you are allowed to have a personality. You have photos of your family on your desk. You have a voice that can complain or suggest. In the Victorian attic prison, you were legally and socially prohibited from forming a single human bond. This was the enforced solitude. Most grand houses had a no-followers rule, a Victorian term for boyfriends or even friends. If a maid were caught talking to a suitor at the back door, or even receiving a letter from a brother, she could be dismissed instantly without a character reference. In 1880, losing your character was a death sentence of poverty, leading straight to the workhouse or the streets. Consider the cruelty of this architecture. The family lived in a world of maximum sentiment, where every locket contained a hair and every wall held a portrait of a loved one. Yet they denied that very humanity to the people sleeping just 30 feet above their heads. The servants were the refugees of reality, living in the center of a family, hearing the laughter of children and the music of the piano, yet they were as isolated as if they were on a desert island. They were witnesses to a life they were legally forbidden to taste. As you sit in your modern room, perhaps feeling the stress of a deadline or a social obligation, feel the weight of that Victorian silence. Imagine living in a house full of people where you are not allowed to speak, where your name is a lie, and where your only privacy is the few hours of dark in a freezing attic before the bell screams you back to life. The Victorian mansion was a masterpiece of engineering, but it was also a machine for breaking the human spirit. But the night is growing colder, and the fire is shifting again. We have seen how they lived and how they worked, but we have yet to face the most terrifying shadow of the attic. What happened when the invisible army fell ill? For in a world built on deception, a sick servant was a broken piece of machinery that had to be discarded. Stay with me, for as we move into the realm of Victorian health and justice, you will see that the cure was often more terrifying than the rafters themselves. The fire is gasping for air now, the wood turning to a skeletal white ash, much like the faces of those who sought refuge in the cold, iron-scented shadows of the Victorian infirmary. As we leave the relentless grinding of the vertical factory behind, we must confront the final, most intimate betrayal of the attic prison: the total lack of control over one's own body. In our modern world, we view healthcare as a right, a sanctuary of data and consent, where we are the masters of our own recovery. But in the 1880s, for the soul living in the rafters, a fever or a broken limb was not a medical crisis. It was a legal one. It was the moment the invisible army became a visible liability. To be sick in the attic prison was to enter a landscape of refining horror. Because the servants lived in such cramped, unventilated quarters, a single cough could be the death knell for the entire household staff. This created a state of medical paranoia. If a maid contracted scarlet fever or the White Death, tuberculosis, she wasn't met with a doctor's empathy. She was met with the fear of the state. The mistress of the house, terrified that the disease might drift downstairs and infect her precious children, would often have the servant removed instantly. Not to a comfortable hospital, but to a fever van, a black, enclosed carriage that functioned as a mobile coffin, whisking the broken machine away to a sprawling, overcrowded isolation ward. Imagine lying in your attic cell, your head throbbing with lead palsy or typhus, listening to the footsteps of the master coming up the stairs. You hope for a kind word, a warm broth. Instead, you are told you have 1 hour to pack your life into a single tin trunk. You are being discarded. This was the shocking contrast of Victorian justice. The elite spent millions on cura e resiliencia for themselves, importing the finest German specialists and the purest mountain air, while they viewed the servant's illness as a moral failing. To be sick was to be unfit, and the Victorian social Darwinism of the time had no mercy for the unfit. Contrast this with the modern WebMD culture you know today. You have the power to research your symptoms, to seek a second opinion, to rest in your own bed. The inhabitant of the attic had no such agency. If they were allowed to stay in the house, they were often subjected to heroic medicine, a terrifying practice where the cure was a form of physical assault. Doctors would prescribe purging and blistering, where caustic chemicals were applied to the skin to create massive, weeping sores, under the misguided belief that the bad humors would leak out. They were treated with blue pills, containing nearly 60% mercury, which would cause their teeth to fall out and their minds to fracture long before the original fever ever broke. This was the deconstruction of expectations regarding Victorian morality. We think of them as the founders of modern charity, yet their justice was built on the horror of contact. If you were a servant, you were a non-person. You were legally and socially prohibited from being a burden. If you could not work, you did not exist. This created a culture of lethal secrecy. Maids would tie rags around their mouths to muffle their coughs. They would bind their swollen, infected joints in tight bandages and continue to haul coal, knowing that a single sign of weakness would result in their instant erasure from the house. They lived in a state of perpetual fight or flight, their nervous systems shattered not just by the work, but by the terror of being found out. As you sit in your quiet, safe room, perhaps with a medicine cabinet full of relief, feel the weight of that psychological cage. Imagine the loneliness of suffering in a house full of people who view your pain as a mere inconvenience to their dinner schedule. Imagine the shadow world of the attic becoming a literal tomb as you wait for the fever van to arrive. The Victorian world was a masterpiece of order, but it was an order built on the systematic neglect of the very people who maintained it. But the night has one final threshold for us to cross. As the embers pulse like a dying heart, we must face the climax of the attic prison, the point where the physical toll and the psychological erasure finally leave a permanent mark. For even a ghost can only be silenced for so long. Before we move to the end of our journey and find our way back to the light of the present, I invite you to subscribe to this chronicle. Your presence here is an act of remembrance, a way to finally see the invisible and give them the recognition they were denied for a century. Stay with me, for the fire is almost out and the walls are beginning to speak. The fire has dwindled to a single, pulsing ember, a lonely red eye staring out from the darkness of the grate, as if witnessing the final, exhausted breath of an era that tried to turn human beings into shadows. We have climbed the vertical Everest of the service stairs, felt the sting of the ice in the attic basin, and heard the hollow rattle of the fever van. But now, we must face the climax of the attic prison, the point where the invisible army finally decided to leave a mark that even time could not erase. In our modern world, we are obsessed with leaving a legacy. But for the Victorian servant, the greatest act of rebellion was the simple, quiet preservation of their own name. Imagine the final hour of a 19-hour shift. The house below is silent, the masters are asleep in their silk-lined cocoons, and you are back in your cell under the rafters. The deception of the house says you do not exist. It says you have no name, no history, and no future. But in the flickering light of a stolen candle stub, you reach out and touch the rough lath and plaster of the attic wall. This is the miseria garrel of the soul, but it is also the birthplace of defiance. Today, architects and renovators stripping the wallpaper from these grand mansions often find what we call the signature of the unseen, a name scrawled in charcoal behind a baseboard, a dated newspaper stuffed into a gap in the rafters, or a single worn-out leather shoe hidden beneath the floorboards for luck. These were the time capsules of the erased. They were saying, I was here, I breathed this freezing air, I hauled the coal that warmed your beds, and I will not be forgotten. This was the deconstruction of expectations. The masters thought they owned the house because they held the deed, but the servants owned the house because they were built into its very bones. They were the refugees of reality, who turned the architecture of their imprisonment into a monument of their existence. But eventually, the great deception began to crumble under its own hypocrisy. This is the guerra y miseria geril that ended the era of the attic prison. When the First World War arrived and the world finally tilted on its axis, the invisible army did something the elite never expected. They walked out. They left the freezing attics and the lead-lined cisterns and moved toward the dangerous but honest freedom of the factories. They chose a world where they had a name, a voice, and a life that didn't end at the rafters. The Victorian mansion, once a soaring machine of social control, became a hollow shell, a museum of a cruelty that the human spirit could no longer endure. Now, as the morning light begins to bleed through the fog outside and the last ember in our hearth finally goes cold, take a deep, clear breath. Look around your modern room. Your walls are thin, they are honest, and they hold no secret stares. You live in a world of maximum transparency. You have a name that is spoken, a face that is seen, and a voice that is heard. The refuge of the past was a beautiful gilded cage, bought with the stolen lives of people who were tucked away like unwanted insulation. As you extinguish the last light of this chronicle, feel a profound sense of gratitude. You are not a ghost in someone else's story. You are the master of your own. I thank you for walking the ghost path and climbing to the attic prison with me tonight. If these echoes of the past have touched a chord in your soul, stay within our circle. Your presence is what keeps these voices from fading into the fog once more. Tell me in the comments, if you were trapped in that attic, would you have left your name hidden in the walls for us to find 100 years later, or would you have burned the candle down to the wick just to feel the warmth one last time? Until the lanterns are lit again, stay safe, stay seen, and remember, even the silent rafters have stories to tell.